I'm Sophia Hansen, General Manager for Newcastle County's Department of Community Services, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to 2016 Newcastle County Reads, an evening with Daniel James Brown. Please join me in giving him a warm Newcastle County welcome. The wonderful book, The Boys in the Boat, has been on the bestseller list for the New York Times for over 99 weeks. I've received more calls and emails from people who have absolutely adored this book. I read it myself, I read the children's version with my children, but probably the most touching comment came from the former Poet Laureate for the state, Joanne Belinget, who wrote to me after she read the book and said, Sophia, at the end of the book, I just sat and cried. And that really speaks to how deep and touching this book was. The Boys in the Boat is a story that had to be told, and I'm just happy that it was told by the perfect man, or the perfect writer, Daniel James Brown. So let's give him another round of applause. I would like to thank the man who made this event possible, Newcastle County Executive Thomas P. Gordon. Please put your hands together for Thomas P. Gordon. And there are a lot of people who work to make this program special, so I'll read through the list and we can clap at the end. The Delaware Special Olympics, Dr. Leach from the University of Delaware, Leisure Fitness, 9th Street Bookshop, the Special Olympics Delaware, Wilmington Rowing Club, Delaware and Newcastle County Libraries, and a special person that reached out to us, a former co-worker of mine with the City of Wilmington, Paula Gatos, who sent an email saying, I have a torch from the 1936 Olympics from when it started in Athens and went to Berlin. And normally you might think this is a crazy call or a crazy email or something like that, but we knew who the person was. So we were delighted that she actually brought the torch here and shared it with us, and it'll be on display after tonight's event. So can we put our hands together for all the people who helped make tonight special? I have a few housekeeping items from our special committee who puts together Newcastle County Reads, and they are, please silence your phones and electronic devices. Please refrain from flash photography. Following the program, if you would please fill out your surveys and turn them into one of the ushers or leave them at an information table. And you can purchase books and have books autographed in the lobby. Mr. Brown will be here with us until 9 o'clock this evening. Now, at this time, I have the honor of introducing a man who is a great supporter of the literary arts and a big history buff. My boss, Newcastle County Executive Thomas P. Gordon.
No, really the only thing I could take credit for is hiring the right person. And the right person in this case was Sophia Hansen. And every year I tell her I don't know how you're going to top last year, but I just can't believe the amount of public that came out tonight to hear this great speaker. And I'm very proud to say thank you all for coming and showing him a Newcastle County welcome. Again, this year we have another great book selection for our program. We're excited to be able to bring to you Daniel James Brown. I'm sure that there have been a lot of lively book discussions taking place in living rooms, churches, and kitchens all around the county. Our libraries have been hosting films and rowing programs along with book discussions for adult, teens, and kids. And that's something that this whole department that Sophia runs brings literature, excitement about book writing and writing stories, and she keeps me busy every weekend with another event of kids writing books. She's the Energizer Bunny, and I have to give her a lot of credit, but what she's done tonight, again, I don't think she'll be able to top. It's just unbelievable. Tonight, another round of applause. Tonight's presentation represents the highlight of this year's program. Daniel James Brown comes to us tonight from Seattle. His first two books were finalists in the Washington State Book Award. The Boys in a Boat won. The Boys in a Boat has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 97 weeks and counting. And the Weinstein Company has signed it to adopt it into a film, which I'm sure is going to be a great film. It is an irresistible, true story about beating the odds and finding hope in the most desperate of times. If you know history, 1936 was a very desperate time in this world as Hitler began his journey to kill 6 million Jews and 50 million people. This book draws on the youth's athletics, diaries, and letters, giving a vivid sense of their camaraderie, dedication, and the long odds they faced in going to get the goal. Mr. Brown has given us a beautiful book full of profound insight that we can use even if we don't row. I think George Brocock summed it the best. Harmony, balance, rhythm. There you have it. That's what life's all about. I met this gentleman a few hours ago. What a humble, wonderful person. And I can be more proud to present to you and ask you to join me in welcoming the author, Daniel James Brown.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. Wow, this is amazing. You know, I just have to tell you that when this book was launched 3 years ago, my publisher sent me out on a book tour. And I think the first stop was a bookshop outside of Chicago. And I flew to Chicago, and somebody drove me almost an hour to this bookstore outside of the city. And I walked in, and there were a grand total of 4 people there. One of whom was my brother-in-law. Another of whom was a homeless gentleman who had wandered in to keep out of the rain and who promptly fell asleep. So it is remarkable to me to see crowds like this, and I'm so grateful for all the readers who've embraced the book and made it such a success. I want to thank the Newcastle County Reads Council in particular for selecting this book and making this event happen. This is the first time I've been to Delaware, and it's a gorgeous place. I'm really enjoying it. So The Boys in the Boat is a story, of course, that culminates at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And I think most Americans, when they hear the words Berlin Olympics or 36 Olympics or the Nazi Olympics, the first thing that comes to mind is naturally the Jesse Owens story. And with good reason. You know, the Jesse Owens story is one of those stories that we keep alive, we tell our kids and our grandkids, we put in our textbooks for a reason. Because it's one of those stories that helps define who we are as a people. It helps remind us of what we value amongst ourselves. And I think this story of these 9 young men who went to Berlin that summer with Jesse on the SS Manhattan, I think it's another story that deserves to be kept alive and told and retold, because it's also a story that helps remind us of who we are when we're at our best. But it's different in several ways, of course, from the Jesse Owens story. There isn't a racial component to it. Jesse Owens' story, of course, is a story of an absolutely extraordinary individual achievement. The Boys in the Boat is really a story of an amazing team achievement, and I think it helps remind us that historically, at least, we've been a people who've been pretty good at pulling together, building great teams, getting things done together. And frankly, I'm not sure that's as true today as it has been historically, and I'll come back to that a little bit. But I do like to start by acknowledging that I think the story is a reflection of who we are capable of being. Now, let me start by telling you a little bit about how I came to write this book. I live in Washington State in a fairly rural area about 20 miles east of Seattle. And although it's fairly rural, we have this dreadful thing called a homeowners association. And I don't know, you may have an HOA that you love. It may do wonderful things for you. Mine is comprised of the 15 or 20 most cantankerous people in Washington State. And we are compelled by our charter to get together once a year and find something to argue about. Usually something weighty, like what color you can paint your mailbox. But I'm indebted to my HOA for one thing in particular, and that is that, I guess it was 7 years ago now, maybe 8, the meeting was at my house, and after the meeting, a lady I knew only as Judy at the time came up to me and introduced herself more fully. And she said that she'd been reading one of my earlier books to her father, and that her father was really enjoying that book, but he was in the last couple months of his life. He was living under hospice care at her home, and he wanted to meet me. So she asked if I'd come down to meet her dad, and I said, of course I would. And I think it was the next day I went down and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rance. And Joe was weak. He was laid out on a recliner. He was on oxygen, but he was very alert mentally. And I sat down next to Joe, and we talked only very briefly about that earlier book. And then Judy steered the conversation into her dad's upbringing. And if you've read the book, you know that Joe had this very, very difficult family situation to overcome as an adolescent during the Depression. And Joe told me that story, and that in itself really got to me, really affected me. But then he went on, and he started talking about how he began to row on the crew at the University of Washington starting in the fall of 1933, and how that had begun to change his life. And how he and his crewmates had wound up becoming arguably the greatest collegiate crew of all time. He wouldn't have said that, but I think it is true. And how they had wound up going to the 1936 Olympics and rowing against a German boat in front of Adolf Hitler for an Olympic gold medal. And I was just amazed as he was telling me this story. I think my jaw literally dropped. But I noticed from time to time that as he was telling me this story, Joe was tearing up. And I noticed that in particular, he was tearing up whenever he talked about any of these other boys who had rowed with him. And I didn't really know what that was about. I thought maybe it was sadness for the fact that most of his crewmates had passed away in the preceding few years. But there seemed to be a lot of pride and joy in those tears. At the end of the conversation, I just sort of blurted out. I was just so smitten by this story. I just sort of blurted out. And I put it completely the wrong way. I said, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And Joe shook his head, and he looked sour, and he looked down at his feet, and he said, no. And he said it that way, no. And my heart sort of sank. And then I'll never forget this, because he looked up, and he had those tears in his eyes again, and he sort of croaked out. He said, but you could write a book about the boat. And I didn't know what he meant at first. I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, this beautiful cedar shell that they rode in Berlin. But then, of course, I realized that by the boat he meant much more than that. He meant those boys who had rowed with him. But more than that, what they had all done together that summer 75 years before in Berlin, and more even than that, really what they had all become together that summer in Berlin, that almost perfect living, breathing thing that a great crew is. And I realized then that that's what those tears were about. They were about pride and joy, remembering the beauty of what had happened that summer in Berlin. And I was completely hooked. And so I started the next day, and I launched myself on what turned out to be about a four-year odyssey, researching and writing the story, and that eventually turned into The Boys in the Boat. Now, since the book's come out, I get emails from readers every day, and there's certain comments that come up over and over. And one comment that comes up literally every day, and you'll see this on Amazon.com reviews too, is because people say, well, I almost didn't read your book because I thought it was about rowing, and really what could be more boring than a book about rowing? Fortunately, most of them go on to say, wow, I was wrong. It turned out to be about much more than rowing. And, you know, that's what I discovered during those four and a half years that I spent developing the book. It really did. It turned out to be a big, epic, sweeping story about the human heart. It turned out to be a story about this one boy, Joe, who first learned that he couldn't really trust anyone in this world, not even his own parents. But then learned that to get what he wanted out of life, he had to learn just the opposite. He had to learn to trust others on a very deep, fundamental level. It was a story about an almost mystical figure, this British-born boat builder, George Yeoman Pocock, and how he shaped the lives of these 9 young men. It was a story about a somewhat difficult, hard man named Al Ulbrichtson, and how he had become literally obsessed with realizing an Olympic dream. It was a love story. It was a story about grit and determination. It was about overcoming long odds. It was about punishing pain, psychological devastation, but also ultimate jubilation. It was a story about the cold realities of living in America during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. It was about Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl, and about propaganda and deceit, and about democratic values come face to face with Nazi cynicism. And really on that level, it was pretty starkly a story of good versus evil. But most of all, it turned out to be this amazing story of 9 very good-hearted young men who came together to become something much larger than the sum of their parts. Now, that's not to say that rowing isn't central to the story. Rowing is really the sort of stage on which these other human dramas unfold. And I have to say that, I think 7 years ago, I probably wouldn't have picked this book up off a bookshelf if I thought it was about rowing. I didn't have any particular interest in rowing, and I probably would have been one of those people who would have said, how incredibly boring. But actually, over the last 6-7 years, I've become a huge fan of the sport, and it turns out not to be boring at all. And I just want to share with you a few of the things that I think are interesting about rowing itself, and then I'll move on to the other parts of the story. But there's a lot of things about rowing that are pretty remarkable. For one thing, there's the extreme physical challenge of the sport. There's very few things that human beings do, either in sports or anywhere else, that put the same kinds of physical demands on the body that rowing does. And I'm talking particularly now about rowing at this very elite level, at this collegiate, Olympic caliber level. It's extraordinarily demanding. A rowing coach once said that putting 8 men or women in a shell and asking them to row a 2,000-meter race is like asking them to play 2 NBA basketball games back to back, but doing it all in about 6 minutes. That's the kind of toll it takes on the body. There's very few things that match it for the exquisite coordination and synchronization and precision of teamwork that rowing involves. Another rowing coach said putting those 8 men or women in a shell and asking them to row that race is like handing them golf clubs and putting golf balls in front of all 8 of them, asking them to swing and hit those 8 golf balls at precisely the same moment and then to do the same thing over and over every 2 or 3 seconds for about 6 minutes. That's the kind of precision that's required. There's the incredible mental toughness that the sport demands, and particularly these kids that I'm writing about rowing up in Seattle out on Lake Washington in January and February, out in the wind and the rain and the sleet with ice in the oarlocks. It takes a lot of mental fortitude to make yourself get up and go out and do that day after day. And yet thousands and thousands of rowers then and today do that just for sheer love of the sport. There's a long, colorful history associated with rowing. I don't remember if it was Harvard that challenged Yale or the other way around, but Harvard and Yale met for a boat race in 1852, and that was the first intercollegiate athletic event of any kind in the United States. There's the aesthetics of the sport, a boat that has found its swing, particularly in these days when they rode in these beautiful wooden shells, really something to behold. And then finally, there's a lot more drama in a boat race than you might expect if you've ever watched one casually from the banks of the river or any place else. So much of the drama in a crew race takes place inside the boat that one of the things I wanted to do with this book was to put you in the boat so you could see the drama unfolding from the vantage point of those who participate in the rowing and the coxing of the boat. And then in the 1920s and 30s and into the 40s, a great deal of the drama came from the sheer spectacle of these events. It's hard to get your mind around the enormous popularity of rowing as a spectator sport in the 1930s, for instance. On a Saturday afternoon, in many places around the country, 70, 80, 90, 100,000 people would turn out on a Saturday afternoon to watch one of these races. Prominent oarsmen would find their pictures on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post or other national magazine. Important races were covered live, coast to coast on radio, and millions of people would tune in to hear the results. A coxswain's sore throat could make headlines in the newspapers. It was just amazing. Actually, at the 1936 Olympics, the rowing regatta grounds at Grunau, just south of Berlin, where they staged the Olympic rowing events, that was the second largest spectator venue at the 36 Olympics, second only to the big, massive Coliseum that the Nazis built for the track and field events in central Berlin. So enormous amount of drama surrounding them, and I have a passage I'd like to read that I hope will give you some sense of the drama, both the drama in a boat and also the spectacle surrounding one of these races. But I'm going to start in the middle of a race, so I need to sort of set the scene here for you. This is June of 1936, and we are in Poughkeepsie, New York. This is the de facto national championship. There are roughly 100,000 spectators there to watch this race. There are hundreds of boats on the Hudson River, the last mile or so of the Hudson River. It's a very long race. It's a 4-mile race. But the last mile or so is just lined with boats full of spectators, everything from rowboats to a Navy destroyer that's there to root on the boys from Annapolis. The race goes off late in the day at 6 p.m. and dusk is falling over the river as it gets started. Now, to nourish their dream of going on to the Olympics later that summer, these boys from Washington State really need to win this race. And in particular, they need to defeat their arch rivals from Cal Berkeley. Kai Ebright, the coach at Cal, has won the 2 previous national championships. But more importantly, he has also twice brought Olympic gold medals back to Berkeley. Al Ulbrichtson, the Washington coach, is absolutely obsessed with making sure that his boys bring gold back to Seattle rather than Ebright's boys bringing it back to Berkeley. In fact, he's told his wife Hazel that if he can't go all the way to Berlin and win gold this year, he's done with coaching. So everything is on the line for Al Ulbrichtson as he's watching this race unfold. He's watching it from an observation train that's running parallel to the river, the train going down the river, keeping stride alongside the boats. And as he's watching this race, he's growing more and more concerned. He's told Bobby Mock, his coxswain, to row from behind, but under no circumstances to get more than 2 lengths behind. But for the first 3 miles of the race, Bobby Mock has been holding his boat a staggering 4 lengths back. And Al Ulbrichtson, who I should mention is a very dour man. He's often called the man with a stone face. He doesn't like to show his emotions. Al Ulbrichtson is becoming more and more desperate, trying to understand what is happening out on the river. And I'll pick it up from there. On the train, Al Ulbrichtson had all but given up. "They're too far behind," he muttered. "They're overplaying their hand. We'll be lucky to finish third." Ulbrichtsen's face was ashen. It seemed to have turned entirely to stone. He'd even stopped chewing his gum. In the lane nearest to him, California had powered back out in front, rowing beautifully. With a tiring field behind them and less than a mile to go, Cal was in a commanding position to win. Kai Ebright, it seemed, had somehow outwitted him again. But if anybody had outwitted Al Ulbrichtson, it was his coxswain, the short kid with his own Phi Beta Kappa key, and now he would show his hand. Suddenly he leaned into Don Hume's face and bellowed, "Give me 10 hard ones for Ulbrichtson." 8 long spruce oars bowed in the water 10 times. Then Mock bellowed again, "Give me 10 more for Pocock." Another 10 enormous strokes. Then a lie. "Here's California, we're on them. 10 more big ones for Mom and Dad." And very slowly the Husky Clipper slipped past Columbia and began to creep up on Navy in second. Someone on the train idly remarked, "Well, Washington's picking up." But a minute later, someone else called out much more urgently, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" On the train and on shore, all eyes shifted from the leaders to 8 white blades, barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another deep guttural roar began to rise from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were half a mile from the finish now, still in third place, 2 lengths back. But they were moving, and the way they were moving compelled immediate and absolute attention. In the boat, Mock was incandescent. "Okay, now, he barked, and Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rance fell in behind him just as smooth as silk, and the boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water, and Washington slid past the middies as if the Navy boat were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain, Grover Clark, glanced across the river, and for the first time since he'd left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up on his stern. Stunned, he bellowed at his crew to pick it up, and Cal's rate climbed quickly to 38. Mock hollered at Hume to take it up another notch, and Washington went to 40. The rhythm of the California boat seemed to waver, then grow erratic. California and Washington careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectators' boats. People in rowboats were standing up now, risking a dunking to see what was happening. Some of the large excursion steamers began to list toward the center of the river as people crowded their rails. The roar of the crowd began to engulf the oarsmen. Boat whistles shrieked. On the float in front of Washington's shell house, Evander May Calamar, the crew's cook, waved a frying pan over her head, whooping and urging the boys on. In Washington's press car, pandemonium broke out. George Farnell of the Seattle Times shoved his press credentials into his mouth and began to devour them. Tom Bowles commenced beating a stranger on the back with his lucky old fedora. Royal Brougham was shouting, "Come on, Washington, come on!" Only Al Ulbrichtson remained motionless and silent, still riveted to his seat, his eyes cold gray stones locked on the white blades out in the river. Joe Williams of the World Telegram stole a glance at him and thought, this guy has ice water in his veins. With the finish line looming ahead of him in the gathering dark, Bobby Mock screamed something inarticulate. Johnny White suddenly had the sensation that they were flying now, not rowing. Stub McMillan desperately wanted to peek, to glance over toward lane 1 where he knew California would be, but he didn't dare. In number 6, over the crowd noise, Shorty Hunt could hear someone on a radio yelling frantically. He tried to make out the words, but all he could tell was that something terribly exciting was happening. He had no idea how things stood except that he still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view. He kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rance's neck and pulled with his whole heart. Joe had boiled everything down to one action, one continuous movement, one thought, the crew's old mantra running on through his mind like a river, hearing it over and over, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp Oxford accent, mind in boat. Mind in boat, mind in boat. Then, in the last 200 yards, thinking itself fell away, and pain suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, descending on all of them at once, searing their legs, their arms, their shoulders, clawing at their backs, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at the air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, rowing at 40 strokes per minute, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat, and by the time the two boats crossed the line in the last vestiges of twilight, a glimmer of open water showed between the stern of the Husky Clipper and the bow of the California Clipper. In the press car, the corners of Al Ulbrichtsen's mouth twitched reluctantly into something vaguely resembling a smile. He resumed chewing his gum, slowly and methodically. Standing next to him, George Pocock threw back his head and howled like a banshee. Tom Bowles continued to flog the back of the fellow in front of him with his old fedora. George Farnell removed the well-masticated remains of his press credentials from his mouth. In Seattle, Hazel Ulbrichtsen and her son, Al Jr., pounded the glass top of their coffee table until it shattered into dozens of pieces. And in the boat, the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. For a long while, Ulbrichtsen just sat there, staring into the darkness as fans came rushing through the car, congratulating him and slapping him on the back. When he finally stood up, reporters crowded around him, and he said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." Then he elaborated, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." Thank you. And you know, thank you very much. That's really the moment at which these guys, I think, knew how good they were. The nature of that comeback and the way Bobby Mock handled that race was so brilliant. I know Al Ulbrichtsen never doubted Bobby Mock again. The press, all the major press writers in America were there that day, and they all took note. Even Kai Ebright, Cal's coach, to his credit, said, I think it was that same day, he said, "Well, we will go and compete against Washington at the Olympic trials, but really, that looks like the boat that should go to Berlin." And in fact, a couple weeks later at the Olympic trials in Princeton, the boys from Washington, again, very handily defeated California and everybody else who entered and won the right to go to Berlin as Team USA. And a few weeks later, they were on the SS Manhattan with Jesse Owens and Louis Zamperini and most of the US Olympic team, and they were on their way to Hitler's Germany. The story culminates, of course, in this great gold medal race in Berlin in August of that summer. And I think we're going to show you a video clip of that in a moment. But before we do, let me remind you of what these boys were up against that day, or tell you if you haven't read the book. First of all, the Americans, the team from Washington, had in the qualifying races, had turned in the fastest qualifying time of anybody there. In fact, they set a world record setting the qualifying time. The British boat also set a world record and had the fastest, second fastest time. But when it came to lane assignments for the medal race, the American and the British boats were mysteriously assigned lanes 5 and 6 out in the windiest part of the longer sea, this body of water on which they were to row. And that was a big problem because it was a windy, blustery day on the longer sea. Italy and Germany, the two fascist states, had turned in relatively slow qualifying times, but they were mysteriously assigned lanes 1 and 2, protected virtually the whole lengths of the race course. To compound their problems, the American stroke, the stroke is the guy that sits right in front of the coxswain. He sets the rhythm for the whole boat. Everybody else in the boat replicates his stroke rate. So he's absolutely critical to the success of the boat. Don Hume, the American stroke, had been ill on and off for weeks with some kind of respiratory infection. And in the days leading up to the medal race, it had gotten progressively worse. He'd been running a high fever. Coach Ulbrichtsen kept him in bed for days, but he wasn't getting better. And Ulbrichtsen wasn't going to put him in the boat until at the last minute, the other boys went to Ulbrichtsen and basically and uncharacteristically demanded that he put Don Hume in the boat. They felt that they'd come this far together. They didn't want to row the Olympic race without Don in the boat. So Ulbrichtsen reluctantly put Don Hume in at stroke, but he was a very sick kid. There were about 75,000 people there that day. Mostly German crowd. There were significant numbers of Americans and other Europeans there as well, but it was mostly a German crowd. As rowing events were about to get underway, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Goering, and pretty much the whole top of the Nazi hierarchy entered the regatta grounds. The crowd began to do the Sieg Heil chant and give the Nazi salute. The Nazis went up on the balcony of a stone boathouse they had built for this event, took their places, and the rowing events got underway. Germany promptly won gold medals in the first 4 rowing events that day, leading up to the prestige event, which is the 8-oared race. But as they won one gold medal after another, the crowd got more and more excited. And as the boys paddled out to the start line for their race, the crowd was chanting Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. They got out to their starting position. They lined up. They're out in the windiest part of the longer of the sea. Their boat is bobbing up and down in the waves. Because it's the windiest part of the course, they don't hear the start when it's called. It's called just with a voice and the drop of a flag. They don't know the race has started till they see the boat to one side of them lurch forward. They dig hard. They row out into the middle of the longer sea, but 1,000 meters down the race course, halfway through the race, they and the Brits are tied for dead last. Bobby Mock, the American coxswain, is the only guy facing forward. He's sitting in the boat watching waves break over his bow and watching Germany and Italy streak down lanes 1 and 2 toward what seemed to be inevitable gold medal and silver medal finishes. But that, of course, is not how it ends. And we're going to see how it ends. When you see this, you will not see the American boat until very near the end of the race, the last 100 meters or so. When you do see them, they'll be at the very top of your screen, and you will see that they have turned things around very dramatically. So if we can show that video. If we can get a little more volume, that would be great. Those are the Americans. And the Germans. And the Italians. Bobby Mock. This is Germany and Italy down the bottom of your screen. There are the Americans up top. You can see what it takes out of these guys. Look at them. That's Bobby Mock. Don Hume feeling better. Joe Rance. Shorty Hunt. And Stub McMillan. If you're wondering about that film, that's a clip from Leni Riefenstahl's big propaganda/documentary that she made for the Nazis in 1936. And Leni Riefenstahl's a whole story unto herself. But whatever else she was a very good filmmaker. And if you're wondering where those close-ups come from, what happened is all the pulled back shots you saw there, she shot the day of the gold medal race. But then she got the Italian and the German and the American guys to row again the next day. And she did put cameras in the boat. And she put them right in the faces of the coxswains and some of the oarsmen. And then what she's done is to cut in those close-ups into the pullback shots. And you notice she does that at a more and more frenetic pace as the race nears its climax. And I think it's a really powerful piece of film in and of itself. Now, along with comments about how they expected the book to be exceptionally boring, there's a couple other things that come up all the time in my emails. And there's two things, particularly in combination, that I find really interesting. The single most common comment I hear is I get emails every day from people say they just finished the book, and they have tears in their eyes as they finish the book. The other thing is that I get emails all the time from people on either side of our political spectrum, sometimes very far to one side or the other, who say basically, if only people on the other side would read this book, the world would be a much better place. And I find that just absolutely fascinating. I have my own politics, but they're not in this book. But what I've been trying to figure out for the last 6 months or so is, okay, so people have a very strong emotional reaction to this book, and people from across the spectrum of our society seem to have a very strong reaction to this book. So why is that? What is it that evokes these emotions? And I think there's a number of things going on. I think for some people who are old enough, there's a sense of nostalgia and of simpler times that have passed by. I think sometimes people are remembering intense bonding experiences that they had perhaps in their youth. But I think mostly it is that at the end of the book, in the epilogue, I do talk about the later lives and eventual deaths of each of these now old men. And people are simply sad to say goodbye to them, sad to see them go. So if that's true, then what is it that's so attractive about these 9 young men? What is it in their characters? What qualities in their lives and the way they conducted their lives make them so appealing to so many of us? And that's what I've been trying to zero in on. And you may have your own theories about this, but these are some of the things I think that are at work here. First of all, it's just really easy to identify with this particular bunch of young men. Their humble origins stamp them as quintessentially American. These are kids that, for the most part, grew up in lumber mill towns and on dairy farms in the Northwest. They're kids who grew strong working in shipyards or with pitchforks in their hands or axes in their hands. So they're everyday working Americans. But to get where they got, to get into that boat in Berlin, they had to take on rowers and young men who were very different from themselves. First, they had to defeat their very good arch rivals at Cal Berkeley, but then they had to go on to defeat kids who, in those days, the kids on the East Coast were mostly rowing for Ivy League schools. Most of them were kids who had learned to row in prep schools. Often they were the sons of bankers or titans of industry or U.S. senators or even presidents of the United States. FDR had 2 sons rowing at the same time that these guys were rowing. So a very different sort of, boys from very different sort of backgrounds. Then they had to go on, take on and defeat kids from Oxford and Cambridge in the UK when they got to Berlin in the trials. Kids who were literally aristocrats in some cases. Then they had to take on and defeat a hand-picked Nazi crew in Berlin. So they were classic American underdogs. They were always taking on and overcoming higher and higher levels of power and prestige, and I think that tends to appeal to all of us. The second thing, and it's very closely related to the first, it may be the first in fact, but it's very hard not to admire their extraordinary perseverance. These were really tough young men, both physically and mentally. The kids that made it into that boat you just saw were the end product of a selection process that whittled hundreds of young men down to those 9. These were the ones who hung in there season after season, rowing out on Lake Washington in the sleet and the rain and the wind and the occasional snow, putting up with Ulbrichtson, who was a very demanding coach, at a time in the middle of the Great Depression when they were having a hard time getting a couple decent meals a day. If you look at photos of these guys, you can always see their ribs. They were burning a lot more calories than they were taking in. And yet they kept at it. They persevered through some really extraordinary challenges. The third thing, I think, is sort of a hallmark of who they were and key to their success, is a little more abstract, but they were very earnest. And what I mean by that is that they took what they were doing seriously when they rowed. They took pride in their rowing. Now, obviously, they took pride when they went to Germany representing their country. Anybody would. The thing about these kids, though, is by the summer of 1936, they were taking pride in how well they rowed every time they went out, whether it was for practice or for a race. And that notion, that attitude, that way of looking at what they were doing really comes from this figure of George Yeoman Pocock, who influenced them so much. Just very briefly, George Pocock was this British-born boat builder who came to Washington and began to build these beautiful handcrafted Western red cedar shells that by the mid-1930s were so beautiful and so state-of-the-art that every collegiate rowing program in the country either had or desperately wanted to have nothing but Pocock-built shells. The thing about Pocock, though, is he was the consummate craftsman. He approached building boats as if it was a craft. And he taught these boys to approach rowing as if it were their craft. And he said, when I build a boat and I walk away from that boat, I leave a piece of my heart in that boat. When you row a race, whether you win it or lose it, I want you to leave a piece of your heart in that race. He taught them that by approaching life, by approaching rowing that way, they elevated themselves as men, as people. They lifted themselves up. Quite aside from rowing better and winning races, they made themselves better men. For Pocock, there was, in fact, even a spiritual dimension to rowing. He said many things like this. Every chapter in the book begins with a quote from Pocock because his spirit so permeated what was happening with these young men. But I'll just read one of these quotes. He said, "It's a great art is rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion. And when you are rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine." The fourth thing that I think is extraordinary about them is the remarkable level of mutual respect and trust that they developed for one another over the course of the years that they came together as a crew. Now, first of all, trust is absolutely essential in rowing as it is in very few other things. It's hard to think of anything where trust is quite as important as in rowing. You know, when you step into one of these shells, they're only about 24 inches wide. Every movement you make affects everybody else in the boat. A flick of the wrist can affect everybody else in the boat. You row with your back to the line. You can't even see where you're going. You're trusting the coxswain to be doing the right thing at all times. But even more fundamentally, you're trusting every other man or woman in the boat to be putting his or her full weight into every pull. Because if he or she isn't, then you're pulling their weight. You're trusting everybody in the boat to get their blade in and out of the water cleanly and at the right time, because if somebody doesn't, it can result in a disaster. So it's a sport that's built all around trust. And you really become part of something larger than yourself when you climb in one of these boats and become part of a crew. And by the summer of 1933, these young men trusted one another and cared for one another on a level that's really hard to do justice to. But one place that I saw evidence of it that I'll never forget is that summer they were in Berlin, every one of them either kept a diary or wrote a letter home to mom and dad. And at some point that summer, every one of them said something like, "Mom, I really hope that we can win this gold medal. It would be just so great to come back to Seattle with a gold medal. But most of all, I hope I don't let the other guys down." That's what mattered to them. That's what they all said. All of them. They cared about not letting one another down, more even than winning that gold medal. And I should say that bond of trust and respect for one another is something they retained for the rest of their lives. I was privileged to know the last few of them in their very old age, and it was absolutely touching to see how close they still were 75 years afterwards. And then the final thing I would point to is the least obvious and, to my mind, one of the most important. And that is that every one of these young men, by the summer of 1936, had developed a measure of humility. Now, make no mistake, these were big, strapping guys. They had healthy egos. It's a fairly audacious thing to go out for rowing at this level, to think you can win a gold medal. They had good, healthy egos. But those years of rowing under Ulbrichtsen, those years of rowing past pain, day after day out on the lake, rowing in the ice and the sleet and the snow, it taught them that they needed one another. It taught them there were limits to what they could do individually, that they could do things together sometimes better than they could do individually. It taught them to listen to Pocock and learn from him. It taught them there were things they could learn from watching their rivals at Cal Berkeley. There are things they could learn from watching each other. And I really think that little measure of humility that they developed was the gateway through which they were able to approach one another and build those bonds of trust that I was just talking about. And humility, I should say, is another thing they held on to for the rest of their lives. These guys, for the most part, when they came home late August or September that year with their gold medals, nice big gold medals, most of them put those gold medals in a sock drawer or put them in a box up in the attic. and they went out and they tried to get a job to get through another year of school. A couple of them never even mentioned to their family members, their kids, until their kids were adults, that there was a gold medal up in the attic, that they had won it. I'm forever, when I talk out in Seattle about this story, Joe Rance worked for years at Boeing. He worked his whole career at Boeing. And I'm always running into people that worked with Joe at Boeing who say, I worked 27 years, 3 desks down from Joe. He never said anything about a gold medal. And, it's really typical. It's really typical of them. And I think it's pretty admirable, actually. So when I stand back from this story and think about what it means to me, and I really wasn't thinking in these terms when I was writing the book, but when I was done, I realized I was going to be talking about it, and I sat down and spent some time just thinking, okay, Dan, you stand back from this book, what's most important to you about this story? What is it, bottom line, what does it mean to you? And it came to me pretty much as a flash. I think this story of these 9 young Americans who climbed in a boat and learned to pull together so powerfully and so beautifully. I think it's an almost perfect metaphor for what that generation of Americans did. I'm talking about the generation that for me was my father and my mother, my aunts and my uncles. And I should say, when you talk about a generation, there are always exceptions. I had an Uncle Bud who was a complete ass. But when I think about that generation, on the whole, I think of what they went through during the Depression. I think they learned a lot of humility at the hands of the Great Depression. I think they learned they needed one another. I think they learned to pull together. I think they learned to do things, build great monuments like the Grand Coulee Dam, but they won World War II on not one but 2 fronts. And after the war, they built the most prosperous era in our country's history. So I'm a huge fan of that generation. In many ways, I find this book a sort of, in my mind, is intended to be a tribute to them. I had a moment when I was in Germany researching the last few chapters of the book. I went to Grunau, to the Langer See, to this place where the gold medal race was held. And I was able to go up on the balcony where the Nazis, where Hitler had stood to watch the race. And as I was standing there looking out over the water, I had a moment of sort of epiphany. And I'd like to close by just reading you, I think it's 3 paragraphs from the end of the book, what was going through my mind as I was standing up there. Let's see. I visited the Wassersports Museum in Grunau, where late in the afternoon, Werner Philipp, the director, kindly led me up a set of stairs to the balcony of Haus West. I stood there for a long, quiet minute where Hitler stood 75 years before, gazing out over the Langer See, seeing it much as he saw it. Down below me, young men were unloading a shell from a truck, singing something softly in German, and preparing for an evening row. Out on the water, a single sculler, his blades glinting, worked his way down one of the lanes toward the large Yale sign at the end of the course. Closer to me, swallows flew low over the water on silent wings, silhouetted against the declining sun, touching the water from time to time, dimpling the silver surface. Standing there, watching them, it occurred to me that when Hitler watched Joe and the boys fight their way back from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany 75 years ago, he saw, but did not recognize, heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, decent and unassuming, not privileged or favored by anything in particular, just loyal, committed, and perseverant, would return to Germany, dressed in olive drab, hunting him down. They are almost all gone now. the legions of young men who saved the world in the years just before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of House Vest, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace, their humility and their honor, their simple civility, and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and finally vanished into the night. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.